Hi, everybody. Another interesting Indie Cafe 2 show. Today we have a very special guest and part of my life, actually. We're talking about Jerry Harrison, who's been with such famous groups as the Modern Lovers and of course, Talking Heads, and also a fabulous producer. And I hear he has some business out there in Mill Valley or Sausalito also. But we're gonna discuss later. I wanted to start the show off because my life in design has part of it has been with this fabulous group. I was very honored to design with Talking Heads, and I want to show you the classic Fear of Music cover, which was nominated for a Grammy. And this is a big play with Jerry because Jerry had the idea of the deck plate design on the front cover. Jerry, could you tell us a little about how this was conceived by you?
It had to do with that pattern deck plate is an anti-skid pattern that people will be familiar with. It's on the back of pickup trucks sometimes, and also on the covers of the doors when you're walking in New York City that go down into the basement. And there's these metal doors, and so people don't slip. There's a raised pattern to create friction with your shoes. And there was a vinyl flooring that copied this, that Tina's brother, who was an architect, Jan Weymouth, had. And when I saw that vinyl flooring, I said, "This is really what should be the our next cover."
Hmm.
And I actually even called the company who made the vinyl flooring, and I said, "Well, could it be thinner?" And well, they said, "No, we can't do that." And I said, "Well, look, this." I was figuring, well, it's a square foot on both sides of the cover. It's if we pressed up 500,000 records, that would be 1,000,000 square feet. I said, "Well, would you do it for a order for 1,000,000 square feet?" And that got their attention, and I got the president on the phone. But eventually, we just decided that it wouldn't. Um, uh, it wouldn't. They couldn't do it,
Yeah.
and then it was, well, how do we do this with paper? And for a long time, Queen's litho acted like embossing was impossible.
Hmm.
And Spencer, you could probably talk about that. I mean, I think they finally just realized that we were always very stubborn with them. We wanted to use Dayglow on Talking Head 77.
Yeah.
They said they wouldn't do that. And then David and I researched and found all these polka records that had Dayglow covers and were
Yeah.
printed out in Ohio. And said, well, we're going to do the album cover in Ohio then. And then Queen's List said, okay, we'll do it. So,
Yeah, and on the cover, I worked on the typography side. That's what I work with Talking Heads, and you see in the top left the title, and that was by in typewriter type.
yeah.
And then we added the Dayglow Green. The inner sleeve is interesting too. I mean, that's another play here. Jerry, tell us about that fabulous photo.
Well, I used to discuss with David that we had used the image of the Landsat satellite for the interior cover of More Songs About Buildings and Food.
Mm.
And David, with his sort of interest in conceptual art, it was like visual imagery that serves a different purpose than art, but then taking that imagery and saying it becoming art. So I
Wow.
knew a doctor who, through a friend of mine who worked for a doctor, we found this place that did for mammograms in the 70s. They did basically an infrared photograph, and so heat sensitive. And so we had pictures of all four of us taken, and we thought about using all four, but we thought the image that, as it ended up, it was David's,
Mm.
was the
Mm.
most striking, and so we went with that one.
Yeah, incredible package, and it's in the MoMA permanent collection and in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame archival collection now, and it's one of those beautiful things. I also worked on some 45s that Take Me to the River, Izimbra, and Cities, which is a separate thing. And now maybe we'll talk about Jerry now and about his life a little bit. And how did you get into Modern Lovers? How did it all start with you, Jerry?
Well, I was going to Harvard, and I was living with Ernie Brooks, and we had been in a band at Harvard, and a friend of Ernie's from Putney, Andy Paley, was in another band that Ernie was in called the Sidewinders, and Andy was from New York City and very into the scene that sort of was around Andy Warhol and knew some of the people. So there was a Cambridge contingent of what they would call Andy Warhol superstars. And if anyone's read the book Edie about Edie Sedgwick, she was sort of for a long time probably the most famous of these. But there was a guy named Ed Hood who's in Bike Boys, and Rene Ricard was going back and forth between Cambridge, New Haven, and New York. Rene Ricard is quite famously portrayed in the movie about Jean-Michel Basquiat that was made, and he was kind of a, considered, many people thought that he somewhat helped alert the art world, we'll say, to the brilliance of Jean-Michel. And so one night, I think Andy came in with, I think it was this group, including Jonathan. And Jonathan had loaded with him, and he demanded we put it on the turntable, and he started singing along and raving about the Velvet Underground. And I was making a film about alienation, and when he was telling me about that he had this band, this sort of early version of the Modern Lovers, that I thought that it was a perfect companion to what I wanted to do in this film. And so I went out and filmed him playing and recorded it, and I was going to edit the music into this film. And so I was listening to it over and over again. And meanwhile, Jonathan had found, that Jonathan was a restless and lonely fellow at that time in some ways. And Ernie and I, he came over and would hang and talk. And so eventually he said, I think you guys should be in the band. And we had Ernie had heard through the door this music playing over and over again. And we sort of like, there's just something really, really catchy and unusual about this. And I had never thought that really I was going to end up being a professional musician. It was more something I did, but partially it's like, okay, I got into a great college. There's all these other opportunities, and I really wasn't confident that I was good enough. And I hadn't spent years studying in a conservatory or anything like this. But with Jonathan, I saw that there was a complete place for what I would want to do on keyboards, and that what we were doing was completely unique and deserved a record contract and was just as legitimate as any artist in the world at that time. So it totally changed my mind. And so we began that pursuit of sort of alerting the world to this sort of unique sound.
Incredible. Great group too. I mean, a really great group.
We went out I arranged for Warner Brothers and A&M to split the cost of flying us to Los Angeles so that we could meet the various people in the record companies that we would be working with. We had this idea that we needed to be, that we had to have believers, so to speak, that it wasn't just about making money. And so we wanted to feel a commitment, you might say, from that the organization that we would be working with would be sort of in line with whatever you would say the modern lover values were. I think this was unique, that no one had ever done this before, but they ended up arranging for demo sessions, and the ones we did for Warner Brothers are with John Cale, and the ones we did for A&M were with Alan Mason. And so we then finally decided that we would sign with Warner Brothers, but by the point that we had taken so long to decide, Jonathan started writing new songs and had was starting to go the direction that, of course, he's pursued for the rest of his career of wanting to be a far quieter and gentler sound, whereas he wanted just the opposite with the Modern Lovers. It was supposed to be very loud, very distorted, very in your face. And of course, it was. So we ended up going and trying to make a record, living in Los Angeles, but it never really seemed that good. We ended up breaking up. And then Jonathan moved to Berkeley, and he was, because there was a guy who started a small record company there called Berkeley Records. And Alan Mason, again, this was a friend of Alan Mason's. He was the manager of this band called Earthquake, or sort of known as Earache in Berkeley. And they did a lovely version of Friday on My Mind, the Easy Beat song. Released. And so we had done shows with them at this sort of Hell's Angels bar on San Pablo called the Long Branch, and they were there's a recording, the Modern Lovers, at the Long Branch. But the reason I bring this long story up is the record that eventually came out were the demo tapes we did a year earlier from when we had tried to make an album. So they were in the spring of 1972, I think, that we went to California and recorded that record, but it did not come out until the beginning of 1976, I think, or the end of 1975. But it was a sort of a template for the sort of burgeoning punk scene, and became. I kind of have always thought of the Modern Lovers as the sort of the first punk band. I mean, obviously the Stooges and the MC5 and the Velvet Undergrounds were inspiring, but they each are a little bit different than what I consider punk. I consider punk to be, it doesn't matter how skillful you are on your instruments. If you have something you want to say, you can find a way to say it, and don't take too long. It needs to be short and to the point, which was really the opposite of the style of music that had become popular, which was the song Nights in White Satin is a horrific version of what music had degenerated into in our minds. Groups like Yes and Emerson, Lake and Palmer, where they were all about sort of chops and having gone to music school. And not like there isn't something good about, it's great that people can play their instruments well, but we felt that it had lost its certain authenticity, and that the Modern Lovers sort of stood as in opposition to that that more complicated and, we'll say, mannerist or ornate vision.
So the Heads, how do you get into Talking Heads?
So they heard this record that came out, and they were looking for a keyboard player. And they ran into Ernie Brooks at the local, and also Steve Paul, who had managed the Modern Lovers briefly, recommended me as someone, because he had known when I met him, I had been doing paintings and sculptures, and he thought that it was a good fit because they had come out of RISD. So they got in touch with me, and it was actually sort of funny. I was really broke. And it took me a little while to come down to New York to sort of try out for them. And the only way I could do it is that we used to use the band van to move families. And so I helped Ernie on this moving job. And when we got all of their furniture into the van, there wasn't any room for my organ. So I just went with a guitar. And they go, well, we're looking for a keyboard player. And I said, well, it couldn't fit in the van. All I could fit was a guitar, but let's just play some music. And it was sort of magical from the moment we started. And and then it sort of, I was just entering architecture school then, and they were gracious enough. I said, my parents will kill me if I don't at least finish a semester so that I could come back. I'd already put it off 1 year I did a record with Elliot Murphy too. And, and did a tour with him, the record Night Lights.
He's great. So Yeah, so I mean, the heads thing was interesting. I mean, for me as a visual group, you're really also besides being dynamic and making music, also visuality is amazing. I mean, a lot of my collection is a lot of the heads visuality, and it kind of like, how did that work between all of you? Because you had these incredible 45s, even the LPs were amazing. You all worked together on that? Is that, or someone brought up an idea and another person, or how did that work?
Yeah, it was people bringing up ideas, and there was a sense that it was obvious that everybody in the band had quite a sense of design,
Hmm.
and so we sort of shared the responsibility. And so David ended up designing the first cover,
Hmm.
and he did the More Songs About Billies and Food with the Polaroids, and
Yeah.
I had sort of floated this idea. He had said this thing about how he was reading a book, I think that was called Fear of Music, which I think was by Oliver Sacks, the guy that did about
Oh.
brain injuries, and I said, what a great album title. So
Right.
we had a title for the record before we wrote the music,
Oh, that's great.
and then and the music I think followed the pattern. It was sort of, in many ways I would say it's our darkest album,
Mm.
and and we so then I came up with this concept of the deck plate, and I think David sort of talked to you about what he thought about type.
Yeah.
David was very much into things like type
Yeah.
bases, and then Chris and Tina, of course, went on to be highly involved in the cover for Remain in Light.
Hmm.
They went to the media lab,
Hmm.
so there was this sense of sharing, but there was also a sense of, and when singles, a lot of times they would be sort of instructions sometimes because we'd be on tour.
Hmm.
So I know that you got involved with that, but also that like the designer Hugh Brown in California did a number
Ah,
of singles. And then Tibor Kalman at M and Company particularly
right.
was involved. And we sort of brought them in uh, to help us complete ideas or also
Yeah.
to be foils to be talking to. Um, and the other thing about it is that I think the Talking Heads are one of the only bands that got to design their own covers. Probably Captain Beefheart, but um, not too many. Usually that was something that the record companies felt that they had the vision for it.
Yeah. Exactly.
But one of the things, of course, about being on a small label like Sire is that Seymour, when he signed the band, he believed in the sort of total vision of the band, and that included the visuals. And so therefore he allowed us to have that freedom.
Yeah. I mean, John Gillespie, as you well know, the art director, he liked. I came in on the Richard Hell album doing minimal inner sleeve type, but then John would say to me, he liked my work. He felt something, and he said, Spencer, I'm going to give you some work with our label, but he said the immortal words, I can't promise you anything. Right. So he threw me into the Ramones. He threw me into the Heads, into the Pretenders, and everything. But I had a good sense of typography. I had a Yale background, had a really good sense of typography. And I think with you guys, it all worked together. The RISD thing, you came from Harvard. The RISD, especially with Yale, with the Joseph Albers background, that there's something that tied us in.
Mm-hmm.
And so I felt very comfortable, and that album cover seemed to flow. What was interesting is John. I walked in one day, and John told me a concept that came with electric lights and a styrofoam and a
Yeah.
disappearing ink. And
Well,
he said we got to get a Russian scientist, Jerry.
that was my idea. I wanted to have an album cover that would, instead of having shrink wrap, it
Yeah.
was it was mylar, so
Oh.
it would have been
Oh.
reflective.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, you wouldn't have maybe had any print on it. It was just
Right.
a mirror, and then you would have the album cover. You would decide when you were going to take the mylar off,
Wow.
because when it was the idea that it was photosensitive ink, that would slowly start disappearing the second it was exposed to the light.
Oh my God!
So
Right.
you would have, you might say, the same way that when you put on an album for the first time, when you cut the shrink wrap to take the album out, this would be, you would have an album cover unveiling moment, and you would decide which of your friends or would have the experience of seeing the album cover for this brief amount of time.
Yeah,
And then,
I got to bring up the Rauschenberg, which
yeah,
won a Grammy. Tell us about the Rauschenberg. That's a story in itself, isn't it?
yeah. Well, I think David had reached out. He knew someone who worked for Robert and had reached out to them about Robert doing possibly an album. And we wanted it to be just the cover. The album was actually delayed coming out because the manufacturing process of the album cover he designed, which any of you who don't know it, is rotating discs
Mm.
that have overlap each other, and so you have these sort of transparencies, but with images in them in different colors that are so that you could sort of make your own design.
Yeah.
And I worked with someone that worked with Robert about. I actually didn't record a record partially because I spent so much time and on the phone trying to find people to do this cover.
Mm.
I kind of took it upon myself to sometimes help. I got very involved, for instance, with the sound of our cassette tapes, and would explore different tape formats with the guy who did quality control at Warner Brothers. And I think that this sort of held me in good stead when I went on to be a producer, because I understood in this investigation the mechanics of what it took to make a record, sound as good as it possibly could, and of course also look as interesting as it could. So eventually, I think it was assembled by teenagers, high school students that were paid, I'm sure, very small wages up in Minneapolis. And I think that they did stuff for Oscar Mayer wieners with sort of plastic packaging.
Yeah. I wonder. Well, you know what? You know what? What is that movie? Stop Making Sense.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Great film.
Yes.
And could you tell us a little bit about that? Do you have a background on that film at all, or?
Well, the idea of a film of the stage being built. Even the first tour that we did with the expanded band, we started as the 4-piece, and then the other members came out. And so that idea of the growing band developed over a couple of tours and sort of culminated in Stop Making Sense. Mm. And David had a vision about for the show, which he worked with. I can't remember a couple of people who helped him with lighting design and with some of the other imagery.
Yeah.
But it was, as I said, it was a refinement of what had been done, the tour that we had done to support speaking in tongues. Mm-hmm. And then he sort of said, I think I can take this another step. So we did another tour, and we had put out a live album. And so we go, like, well, we want to record this and make a live record. And eventually we realized that Jonathan Demme came to us and wanted to make a film. Mm. And Warner Brothers said, we just put a live record out. It's not the right time for this. And we we ended up putting up $1 million towards the project ourselves. Mm-hmm. And then Warner Brothers, I think, matched that. And then Island Alive came in. Mm. But the show that's in the film is basically just really well filmed by Jordan Cronenworth, I think is who was the DP on it that Jonathan brought in. Mm-hmm. And it sure has stood the test of time. Just before the pandemic began, there was a new digital, what's it called, the DPS or something like that. This is the new format the movie theaters use. Yeah. And the sound was fantastic, and the color, like the telecine and stuff like that, was really rich and wonderful.
Hmm. The film is unbelievable. It's a classic. It's like if you're going to do a book on rock movie posters or something, you have to have the poster, and you got to have listen to see the film as a film person, which I interview a lot on. And now the other party, there's many parts you like, but let's go into the producer. You've done so much work in so many different areas of that. Are there any sort of as a producer, any stories on that?
I got to do a huge variety of bands. And when I finally decided I was going to be a full-time producer and not be pursuing my solo band Casual Gods so much, which basically because it just when I did the second Casual Gods record, which was my third solo record, the cost of the tour of the previous record had sort of it cost me enough money to have the high quality band plus tour support. It just financially was not making sense, and my wife had just got pregnant, and we were sort of talking about, well, now we're going to have a child, and she said, I really kind of urge you to. You're really good at producing. You should do that. And so I sort of started moving towards that.
Mm-hmm.
And then I had this, I had done some really notable projects before this. This year, I'd done the Violent Femmes. I had done Fine Cannibals. I did the Bodines.
Mm.
I did
Wow.
a single called "Driving Away from Home" by It's Immaterial that was in the top 10 in England.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I took my name off of that stupidly because they had done a mix. They did a mix that I thought I wanted them to at least show the mix that I had done someplace, and they kind of refused. Then it became a hit record. I go like, well, I'm going to learn from that. So anyway, I came out of like sort of fitting production in around Talking Heads projects and my solo albums, and I should really mention is that when I was working on Casual Gods, my dad died suddenly, and my mother had cancer. I'm an only child, and so I basically started living half the time back in Milwaukee, where I grew up. And I used to go out to bars to see bands. It was the sort of normal way that I like entertained myself, and both in New York or anywhere in the world, that's what I would do. And I was like, there were these younger brothers of guys who I knew in bands when I was in high school that had contemporary bands at that point. And I said, well, what's the best recording studio? And they said, well, you wouldn't believe it, but it's in this guy's basement. And so they told me who it was. And he actually was the younger brother of someone who had been a very close friend of mine in very early childhood, in nursery school and in elementary school. This really brilliant painter as well, who ended up committing suicide just after high school, graduating from high school. So his younger brother had this recording studio in a bomb shelter, and which had been the older brother's bedroom. So I knew it. And I knew his parents, who had passed away similarly to mine, and my mother was still alive at this time. But so I started working there, and it was, the rate was like unbelievably fair compared to New York. And it really allowed me the time to explore what I'd heard of the studio. And he's a terrific engineer, David Vartanian. So he went on to engineer the Casual Gods, the record, and the record I did with the Violent Femmes. He worked on the Poi Dog Pondering that I produced. But he's a homebody, and he didn't want to travel when people wanted to work in other states and stuff like that. And so eventually we were I think it was by this point we were on to our third child, and my wife had a bad experience with a homeless person in New York. This is right around with her trying to stuff kind of bloody bread into our daughter's mouth.
Wow.
She was pregnant and taking our other two children. And she goes, I don't know if I can handle 3 here. So we started thinking about other places to live, and that's why we ended up here in California.
Mm-hmm.
And there was, San Francisco because of was one of it was like the idea was like, well, where can we go that there's recording studios and that bands will come to make records? And I didn't particularly want to move to LA at that point. I didn't feel comfortable raising my kids in LA. And so, I mean, maybe that was dumb, but we moved to San Francisco, and there's a whole infrastructure of recording studios here that dates
Ah,
back to
yeah.
the Summer of Love period.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's like, old equipment and people, and in fact, there's almost a fetishizing of old equipment here. So you have
Wow.
had these techs that knew how to fix things and build things. And so it was a great place to make records. And there were some really terrific studios, particularly in this county that's right across the Golden Gate Bridge. So we moved, first of all, we lived on houseboats in Sausalito.
Mm.
And then we found a house that we bought and wanted, but it was basically a house to sort of completely remodel, which we did over the course of a year and a half or 2 years.
Mm.
I'm quite interested in the production discussion because, listening into everything here, it's such, in terms of your music career and experiences and the stories you tell, to the multidisciplinary aspect of it. As a player beginning and having everything from music to design to this vision, it sounds as if you're a player who rose to recording artist, but who rose to producer, but that producer mindset was with you all along. Did you have a point when you realized, hey, wait a second, this production, this is what I've always been doing, and this is really at the heart of my process, my creative process?
Well, I think it was also that the process of working with Eno was that the recording studio was to be played like an instrument is played. And there was also a revolution that went on in the making of records where if you look at the pictures of the Beatles recording, you'll see that the EMI recording technicians are often wearing lab coats. And it was sort of like the musicians were on the other side of the glass in this room that had certain kind of acoustics that would be good for a style of recording, usually about orchestras with the bigger studios. And then on the other side, there was all this machinery, all of it quite sort of cumbersome and big when I first started. And over time, as the equipment developed and more tracks were available for making music, there was this idea that you could construct an album more piece by piece rather than just capturing a performance of a bunch of people playing at the same time. And as well as that, then people started designing drier and drier recording studios so that there was less leakage between microphones, which then later on it became like you want the leakage, but these things come in and out of fashion. But that was a way that you could then replace things. People could replay replay parts. And eventually, of course, then people started making the control rooms to get bigger and bigger because people would be sitting in the control room recording with the engineers. And so the process became married together. And Eno was a sort of at the forefront of thinking of the studio that way. And so, David and I we always were there. I think Chris and Tina just got bored being around the studio. So they weren't as, particularly when we got to Remain in Light, they just didn't have the patience at that moment or the interest, maybe even the interest. But I think that sort of inspired me that I could do this. And then Nona Hendrix asked me to produce her. And I was like, oh, wow, I wonder, can I do that? And So I produced a single with her, and I had been hanging out with Busta Jones, who was quite confident, and I'd gone down to Philadelphia when he at Sigma Sound, where he had made a solo record. So I really liked this backup band that had played called The Pockets. They were from Baltimore, and so we did this single, and I brought in Busta as a co-producer, and that was sort of my introduction to being in charge. And it was scary at first, but the single came out good. It came out in France. It was not, she ended up doing with Material a much more successful record. One of their earliest the successes of Bill Laswell and Michael Bindhorn. But it was like, then I was off to doing this, and then Jonathan Demme asked me to produce, was that next? The Fine Young Cannibals, who were going to be in the for the film Something Wild, I think it was. And he loved their old version, but when we got in the studio, they wanted to sound like Madonna. And I was using an engineer from Sigma Sound who had moved to LA, and so he knew. So we made this song "Ever Fallen in Love" that sort of set the course for the album "The Raw and the Cooked," which was this gigantic album.
It was.
The rest of it was done by David Z up at Paisley Park, Prince's studio. But the first song that sort of set the stage was this one I did, "Ever Fallen in Love." And anyway, so all of these things of working with, I started to have, first of all, now I knew different engineers, I knew things about them, and I knew that I could start to feel confident that I could get the right sounds because I could hire the right collaborators and the right, I knew I had been the person who had found Sigma Sound in New York from having been there in Philadelphia, where Talking Heads then made finished Remain in Light, and I found Blank Tape where we did the basic tracks for Speaking in Tongues, and then we were back at Sigma Sound to do Little Creatures and True Stories. And so I was kind of involved, as I said, I got involved in the mechanics of making sure that our records were finished all the way through and sounded as good as possible, because I had seen how something that sounded really good in the studio could be destroyed in the, you might say, post-production and post-mix environment where all these transfers took place, that if you didn't oversee them, that something could be really spoiled. And so that held me in good stead as a producer because I understood the process.
Did you get involved with Talking Head sound at all? Also, question.
Well, sure. I mean, but mainly by the sounds I made on my instrument. But I mean, there was working with Brian, there was it was a free flow of ideas. I mean, he was the person who had the experience, so therefore, particularly on more songs about buildings of food, we were learning from him. But by the time, even by Fear of Music and beyond, there was a little bit more of confidence on our part to suggest paths forward of modifying a sound by effects and things like that.
I think Fear of Music also charted very well on Billboard. I remember it was a big turning point album in a way,
Yeah, and it was interesting because More Songs About Buildings of Food, the single "Take Me to the River" actually was an AM hit.
Yeah.
And so Life During Wartime was sort of a breakthrough in the world of FM. And it's like, and it also became a calling card. Do you remember when that there was this sort of anti-disco movement that ran?
Oh yeah.
And they would like burn or break disco records at Comiskey Park in Chicago, and I think they would play Life During Wartime because it was "This Ain't No Disco." This was fooling around. It was, even though
great song.
Even though we like disco. So.
I love that song. And the other thing you brought up was interesting. Here's a good trivia question. Robert Fripp is in Izimbra, right? He's playing on.
Yeah.
I love Fripp and Eno when they started that label they were on. Remember, they were always visionary people, you know, and it's not unusual to find that Eno hooked up with you guys on heads, you know.
We met him when we were on tour with the Ramones before our first record came out in 1977. Oh, wow. And I think that we, I wonder if we played him some stuff, but he really liked the way our first album sounded, and he was like kind of shy about it. Like, but we were we had been working with Tony Bon Jovi, who had produced the Ramones and went on to build the Power Station, a notable studio in New York. But Tony was an engineer. I mean, that was his approach. He wasn't musical. He brought someone in, Lance Quinn, to do that. And
right.
We didn't want to, you know, he was a perfectly good engineer, but we wanted sort of the creative process to be a little bit more, I don't know, experimental.
Yes.
And so we asked Eno if he would be interested in doing the album, and he was. And he brought in a terrific engineer, Rhett Davies, who went on to become a producer in his own right, who worked with Dire Straits and various other people. Well, I haven't told you, since you were talking about me having broad interests, I have a few companies I started.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
I started a company called GarageBand.com that became iLike. I was on the board of directors of a microprocessor company called MicroUnity that sort of rethought computers not as calculating machines, but as machines to deliver data. And we eventually went through and ended up, everybody copied their patents, and we ended up realizing a terrific amount of money from patent infringement, which taught me a lot about business and law and things like that. And then currently I have a company that's called Ophorix, that is a treatment for snake bites all around the world. And snakes, mosquitoes kill the most people, humans the next most people, and after that, snakes. 125,000 people every year die of snake bites. And 500,000 plus are maimed. And we think we have the treatment that is, you know, doesn't require being in a hospital. It's something practical you could actually carry in your pocket. And it also perhaps is a treatment for acute respiratory distress syndrome, which is what people die from when they die from COVID. It's usually ARDS because they can't breathe, and it's an autoimmune problem with what's called the cytokine storm. We believe it's a treatment for that. So we're in clinical trials about these things, and hopefully we'll have actionable data and maybe be on the market in 2023 or 2024. So that's very exciting. And you know, talk about doing something. I mean, it will help people in the United States everywhere, but it also will help pets that get bitten by snakes. But places like India, the cost of treating one child for snake bite can basically be bankrupt a family forever, so that they don't have the money if another child or the father got bit or the mother got bit. And so we're going to change all that.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
Wow.
So it's pretty incredible.
Yeah, you carry over your amazing mind into other facets of life, and I love that. You know.
Yep. All right. What a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Hey, thank you, Jerry.
Thank you.